by carbon. No. Okay, we are recording.
Yeah.
Nothing else. So they are beneficial by eating some pests, but the problem of this group is that there is also intragroup predation. So they are eating among each other, and carabids and spiders and predatory true bugs and so on and so on. So they provide ecosystem service of pest predation or pest control. Also, carabids are preying upon seeds, so they are providing weed seed predation and weed control in agroecosystems. The more efficient biocontrol agents are parasitoids, which are typically more specialized, so there is very limited intragroup predation or parasitation, and in many cases they are very efficient in killing pests. Another important ecosystem service is pollination. So there are many different groups of pollinators, like bees, hoverflies, butterflies, and so on. And of course, there are not just ecosystem services, but also something negative, ecosystem disservices. Animals who are decreasing crop yield, typically it can be a pest in the case of arthropods, or it can be a pathogenic organism, some fungi, and so on and so on. So we are sometimes also interested in these species which are providing some disservices. Why we are interested in agricultural landscape? Because they changed a lot in last century. And this is a picture from České středohoří. When I'm talking to some students from abroad in Prague, I'm providing them with idea to go there, because it is just 70 kilometers from Prague and really nice landscape, and it is somehow virgin agricultural landscape, because there is a fine scale mosaic of different habitat types, and unfortunately, in great majority of temperate areas across the globe, the intensification of agriculture results in much more boring landscapes full of large blocks of arable land, almost without any non-crop habitats. And non-crop habitats were mentioned in the title, that it is probably something important, and great proportion of our agricultural focus research is focused on non-crop habitats and their role in supporting diversity in agricultural landscape and ecosystem services and so on. Why we have these boring, simplified landscapes? Because we are able to produce super huge machines and easily manage huge areas of many thousand hectares per day. We are able to till or harvest and so on. So from short-term efficiency point of view, it is beneficial for farmers to produce crops in super huge arable fields. But of course, from point of view of sustainability, it can be somehow problematic, because these non-crop habitats and diversity at different levels of agricultural landscape is very important. And so there are recently many different ideas how to modify our agriculture to be more sustainable and biodiversity supporting. I agree with the group of European researchers who think that organic farming, which was promoted in the last 20 or 30 years, is probably not the solution, because when you apply these approaches, especially in some crops, you are decreasing yield a lot and supporting biodiversity not so much. So probably another approach, including restoration of non-crop habitats and so on, can be more useful and valuable approach. Here is a study showing that when you are applying so-called agri-environmental schemes. So you are paying to farmers for behaving more ecologically or diversity friendly. If you use it in a way that you modify in the framework of land sharing, for example, you apply organic farming, benefit for biodiversity is there, but it is not so strong in comparison to setting aside land from production and creating some non-crop habitats there. Yes. Here you can see how much money we are spending for such agro-environmental measures or schemes, so huge, billions of euro every year. So this money probably can be used in a more efficient way to support biodiversity. The problem of recent agri-environmental schemes is that many of them support some kind of non-permanent habitats like flower strips and so on. But in agricultural landscape, traditionally, there was occurrence of many types of permanent habitats, like some hedgerows and woodlots and small meadows and so on and so on. So it is necessary to somehow distinguish between different non-crop habitat types. And I will start with some of our studies from agricultural landscapes. This is very, in fact, data set is very old from my PhD times. We were interested if size of non-crop habitats. We sampled from very small non-crop habitats, just few hundreds of square meters to almost 1 hectare, or more than 1 hectare in size. And you can see an example of carabids and spiders that even that typically small non-crop habitats were more species rich than large ones. It was because spillover of carabids from arable land into non-crop habitats, but still there were some carabids which are not occurring on arable land. And even in these very small non-crop habitats, there were on average 5 species of carabids who are not able to survive on arable land. So even very small non-crop habitats can be real habitats for animals who are not able to survive for a long term on arable land. Of course, when we are interested in non-crop habitats, we want to know something about distribution of species around this boundary ecotone, and especially if this distribution of species in agricultural landscape is stable in time, or there is some temporal variability. So in this study, we compare different periods of year, and you can see that the non-crop habitats are, and especially their boundaries, are becoming very important for carbon beetles before and after winter, because many species which are profiting from arable land during growing season are not able to overwinter successfully on arable land, so they need presence of non-crop habitats in surrounding, and they are accumulating there for the winter. So another study which is right now under review somewhere. We focused on different types of non-crop habitats, these which are forested or which are grassy. If they are similarly important for different groups of ground-dwelling arthropods during winter for overwintering. And here you can see red color is arable land, green boundary, blue inside of non-crop habitat. And you can see that for carabids, staphylinids, boundaries are really important, and in general there are almost no overwintering animals inside of arable land, much higher abundances or densities are inside of non-crop habitat. But for some other groups like spiders or myriapods, interior of non-crop habitat is of the same importance as the boundary. So the size of non-crop habitats probably is important for these groups. In contrast, lengths of boundaries between non-crop habitats and arable lands are more important for carabid beetles and road beetles. In another study, which is really multi-taxa, we were interested if different species composition of woodlots inside of arable land affect arthropod assemblages, species richness, and so on. So we compared woody islands, woodlots inside of arable fields, which are covered by invasive tree species, Robinia pseudoacacia, or native species. Typically, it was oak or other abundant broadleaf species in Czech Republic. And what is interesting for almost all multi-taxa studies is that responses were contrasting. There were some species, some groups for which presence of invasive tree species is beneficial. We made some more detailed analysis in this study, and it is probably because of moderating of vegetation structure, because Robinia pseudoacacia creates sometimes quite sparse forests. So herb layer can be more developed and more diverse in some cases, and also some, for example, you can see laterites, which were positively affected by Robinia. Also, there is a large proportion of wood which is exposed directly to the sun, which can be beneficial. On the other hand, some other groups like butterflies, including moths also, they suffer from Robinia, and when you make more detailed analysis, you can see that, for example, species which are linked to feeding on a tree canopy are quite species poor in invasive Robinia woodlots, whereas species which are feeding on herbal or shrub layer, they are typically of the same diversity or even more diverse in acacia, Robinia pseudoacacia woodlots. I want to be fast. Another study, again, continuing in our focus on woodlots in agricultural landscape, but it is from South America, from soybean fields. We were interested, unfortunately, I can't see these pictures here, but I think that I know what is there. There is experimental design that we were interested in. Thanks a lot. In both landscape structure, so proportion of, because here around Cordoba city, there are remnants of original Chaco forest, and this Chaco forest is scattered in agricultural landscape. So in some areas there is quite a huge proportion. In some areas there is just one very small woodlot. So we were interested if proportion of Chaco forest around our sampling site, and also how distance from this Chaco forest affect communities of arthropods and ecosystem services, and the final ecosystem service, which is crop yield, of course, especially for farmers, but also for us, because we want to eat something. And in general, you can see that both distance from forest remnant and also proportion of forest cover in the surrounding have beneficial effects on many beneficial arthropods, for example, parasitoids here, and also for this final ecosystem service yield, which is in different way shown here. shown here. And if we are interested in mechanisms responsible, it seems that in general, forest proximity and forest cover is beneficial for predators and parasitoids. But there are also some direct negative effects on ecosystem disservice, like herbivory, proportion of leaf area eaten by herbivores, or yield. Yeah, we can discuss later why not everything can be explained based on groups which are responsible for these ecosystem services. And another group of studies we performed in Czech Republic is focused on quite original non-crop habitat. It is so-called field defect. It is area where you want to plant crops, but because of some extreme environmental conditions or because of an error of man who is driving tractor or who knows, some patches emerge inside of the crop where crop is not growing. And these field defects can differ in size from few square meters to many hundreds of square meters or even 1 hectare. And of course, also farmers sometimes employs different approach what to do with these field defects. Sometimes they are resowing it with some improving crop, or but in many cases they are left for a natural succession of wheat communities. So we were in our first study, we were interested how carbid beetles are using such field defects as alternative habitat to crop which is everywhere in the surrounding. And it is important to note that we were quite sure in the beginning, from the beginning, that these habitats will be suboptimal for carbid, because carbid beetles, probably you know, they are from suborder Adephaga, and all other families from this order are inhabiting freshwater habitats. So also carbid beetles really likes humid microclimatic conditions, even if they are living in quite dry habitat like arable fields typically is quite acidic habitat. Yeah, and we really see that inside of field defects there was lowest species richness and activity density. It can be also called abundance of carbid beetles, but because from the spring till summer, field defects are typically, or vegetation inside of field defects is typically developing, and there was quite a huge diversity in crop cover of our investigated field defects. You can see that if this field defect is overgrown by weed vegetation from 80% or more, then species richness is equal to surrounding crop. And of course, this can have some management implications, and we were also interested in ecosystem services, somehow related to carbid beetles in this study system of field effect. And what is probably quite important for us, that abundance or activity of carbid beetles, different guilds of carbid beetles, for example, medium-sized carnivores or medium-sized herbivores, are really positively correlated or linked to ecosystem services provided. We were measuring directly with artificial caterpillars or with seed carts and so on. Later on, we get idea that because effects on carbid beetles were rather negative than positive, but our observations from the field told us that it can be a different, effects can be different for another groups, or we performed manipulative experiment in collaboration with farmers that we created these artificial field defects, and some of them were resown with Onobrikis plant. It's important to know that it was performed in 2017 or 18, I'm not sure, but it was very dry summer. So effect of this treatment of additional sowing was not very strong because just few plants were able to grow and flower during that summer. But in general, still we can compare effects of these field effects to crops. And one study was performed on parasitoids because it is not very easy to merge parasitoid data together with other groups, because in parasitoids it is very problematic to identify them to the species level. So it is not very comparable. It is almost impossible to compare such data to species level identified data for other groups. And still we were able to collect quite huge data set of more than 200 morphospecies. Some of them are very important parasitoids of important pests in oilseed crop. And for parasitoids, effects of here yellow is oilseed rape crop, green and blue are artificial field defects. You can see that especially during oilseed rape flowering, there is no significant difference between parasitoid communities inhabiting crop or artificial field defects. But few weeks later, when oilseed rape became some kind of dessert for animals in Central Europe, you can see that these field defects, which are developing, they are more and more vegetated and more flowering, they became quite important habitat, which is possible to create inside of arable field. I have no detailed results here, but we were of course comparing if defect creation inside of arable field or on the edge, if there is a difference because of spillover of species from neighboring Noncrop habitat and so on, but there was no difference, and this was true across different taxa. So it seems that it can be quite interesting new agri-environmental measure, because it is very simple to do it in the field. Because if you are establishing flower strip or whatever, it is quite time consuming for farmers. But if you are sowing your crop and you just put off the sowing machine and few meters, and after a few meters you put it on and you create this field defect, it costs 0 Czech crowns and no additional time for the farmer. So yeah, we also were interested in effects of these artificial field defects to another groups of arthropods, and in general there was a pattern that species which are ground dwelling, like carabids, Subunits, millipedes, and of course partly spiders, but many of spiders are web building spiders which need plants. So these effects were negative. Their abundance or species richness was higher in crop, but for species which are somehow related to plants, butterflies, bees, hoverflies, and so on, true bugs, there are quite strong positive effects of field defects for them. So if you want to support pollinators or groups which are feeding on plants and so on, this environmental measure can be meaningful. Still, there is a question to resow or not such, and it doesn't matter if artificial or natural field defects. Our experience from the field, our experiments were performed in České středohoří, and there are quite species-rich and interesting weed species communities. Sometimes in field defects you can see such a huge population of endangered species and so on. So we think that resowing, it is time consuming and you should invest into seeds, material and so on. And sometimes you can kill quite nice and endangered species which will be able to survive there. So probably it is better not to resow such field defects. Quite extreme case of environmental friendly measure or biodiversity supporting measure we performed in Prague in collaboration with city, and we were offered to do something with area of several. It is around 80 hectares of arable land in quite close to city center, as you can see, and in collaboration also with Prague Zoo, we changed arable land into some kind of dry grassland. In the central part there is area for horses, Převalského, but in these areas here and here, we established a system of Onobrichis patches. Onobrichis is this plant which is the host plant for this blue butterfly. I'm sorry that it is in Czech because it is from another presentation. And this species gone extinct 20 years ago in Prague, or it was observed in 2004 for the last time. And we reintroduced this species to Prague and to Prokopské údolí Natural Reserve, which is neighboring with this area, using these patches of Onobrichis plants. Here, dark green patches you can see from aerial photo, and we are managing these patches to keep plants growing throughout and flowering throughout the growing season. So yeah, this is quite extreme case of converting arable land into anything else, but sometimes probably it can be meaningful. Yeah, and here you can see that we are performing every year mark, capture, recapture study focus on this population, and we also have data. Here is Prokopské údolí National Reserve, and it continues few kilometers here, and we have data that probably it should be confirmed by molecular methods, but that probably our reintroduced population is spreading throughout the Prokopské údolí, and we have observations 2 or 3 kilometers away from this site of reintroduction. So it seems that it will be a successful project. Yeah, another project we are working on right now is project focused on white flower strips, because we are not very happy with setting of this environmental measure in Czech Republic right now, because you are forced as a farmer to seed a flower strip and destroy it after 2 or 3 years and reseed it again. And our idea is to develop something like permanent flower strips, which will improve structure of agricultural landscape. But right now, there is also motivation from legislation that farmers are forced to decrease size of their arable fields, and permanent flower strips can be a solution how to separate particular arable fields from each other. So we are in collaboration with one agricultural company in Prague. We are testing some mixtures which are more species rich, and so what is most important, there is proportion of grasses which stabilize somehow plant community of flower strips. So our idea is that, or of course inspiration is from other countries, because this kind of flower strip is already used in Belgium, for example, or partly in France. So this can be quite interesting for both farmers and people interested in biodiversity to develop such more permanent flower strips. Another project we are right now working on in collaboration with colleagues from United States and Germany is focused on yield maps, because you can get a feeling when you approach arable field that it is quite homogeneous. But in fact, in many areas, there is a huge variability inside of the field in distribution of fields or plant biomass and so on. So of course, this tool can be very useful if it is somehow linked with knowledge ecological in selecting which sites are the most useful for both for biodiversity and for setting aside from production for farms, because there are several studies from South America that on average 5 to 10% of arable land per each farm, but of course this differs regionally, but on average are on the edge of profitability or below threshold of profitability. So farmers are investing their money and time and whatever to manage land which in fact cause them financial losses. So if we are able to identify these areas and then to propose in a clever way what to establish there, if I don't know, because here it is full of forest in the surroundings, so probably in this patch it will be much nicer to establish open habitat, a meadow there. On the other hand, here in the middle of open landscape, it can be nice to establish woodlots there. Of course, there are some general ecological rules like habitat heterogeneity or habitat connectivity and so on are benefiting biodiversity. So if you employ such rules in designing or redesigning agricultural landscape, it can be a way how not to lose yield, because still human population is growing and will be probably growing for next 30 years, or I don't know how long, based on United Nations estimations. And so we need food for sure. And at the same time, it is quite clear that because of decreasing biodiversity in intensive managed agricultural landscapes across the globe, we should to make something in following years. So this can be a way how to balance or optimize quite small losing of yield and quite high benefit for biodiversity. And that's all. I should to thank to all team members and collaborating colleagues and of course sponsors, and to you for your attention. Thanks. I will escape from camera.
Thank you very much for a nice presentation, Michal. I have actually 2 questions and 1 comment. I will start probably with the comment, and it's exciting to see like final parts of the presentation where we are trying to find how we could use more nicely those not profitable parts of the fields. It's exactly what we are trying to do when protecting lapwings in the arable land. Luckily, lapwings are choosing more better parts of the fields, and sometimes it's like easier to convince the farmer.
In fact, these arable defects I was talking before, partly they are on very dry side, but partly they are also on very humid parts of arable, where in the spring it is impossible to sow there something, and these patches can be very nice also.
Yeah, exactly. We use this for lapwings, and it seems to work nicely. Sometimes they really use those sites, and farmers do not have a good profit on that anyways, and with some subsidy for lapwings, they can use it nicely. And then, Mike, one question: you mentioned that animals feeding on plants are like more supported by those defects, but in reality, it seems to be that those are mostly the mobile species. So I would guess that it has more connection with their mobility, like the bees, butterflies, that they can find the patch of the different habitat in the desert of Wales, right? Or if it's like the host specific, I think that the mobility must play an important role there. I cannot imagine like maybe need to go 1 kilometer to the next patch.
When we compared composition of, and it is not distinguished here, because we were trying to analyze it, of arthropod communities inside of field defects in the interior of arable field and on the edge, there was no difference. So probably all groups were able to disperse at distance of many tens of meters. So probably dispersal limitation will not be the case. But and of course also in these groups, which looks like dispersing not a lot, like Caribbean beetles, some small species are able to fly, large species are quite good runners, so they are able to run many tens meters a day. So I don't think that there is a real dispersal limitation as a problem.
I have a related question actually. So like here you compare the abundance and species diversity. But how does it work in terms of species composition? How these communities overlap? So, for example, because you mentioned that the field defects are pretty bad for the carapace because there are not that many of them, but are these just like a random subsample of the field community, or do they differ?
In the case of carapace, probably yeah. You can see that they are somehow separated. These red dots, which represent crop, and green and blue are artificial field defects. So you can see that there is, I think that for more than half of taxa it was significant separation in community composition. But for parasitoids from the previous study, it was interesting that there were quite a lot of species inside of artificial field defects which were not occurring inside of crop. But for huge majority of these taxa, I think that overlap was quite huge. It was just rarely some super interesting from conservation point of view species was occurring only in arable field defect. On the other hand, our field defects were quite small. It was these larger ones are 18 to 18 meters. And I can imagine that you can create more attractive habitats, which can really work as a habitat, not just as some source of nectar, but because of course in agricultural landscape, you need to establish new real habitats which will enable reproduction, nesting of, I don't know, solitary bees and so on and so on. So maybe that these artificial field effects in our study were too small.
Okay, and in case of the parasitoids, what do you think was the driver? Is it like there are different parasitoid hosts feeding on the weeds in the patches, and that's why the parasitoids are there, or are they there because of the nectar?
Probably it is a combination. And unfortunately, we were not collecting data on pests in this study. So we don't know potential spectrum of hosts available in field defects. So who knows, but probably a combination.
Just related to this, like what you know, if they are beneficial to butterflies or bees, you could at least guess if these parasitoids are also like hosted by these.
The problem is that knowledge on biology of parasitoids, especially in the case they don't have species name, for example. It is quite problematic issue. So at least I'm not able to provide you with a satisfactory reply because I'm a specialist on parasitoid ecology. But Ezekiel, who was sorting parasitoids, and we had some collaboration with guy from Charles University or Crop Research Institute who are more focused on parasitoids. Still, we were happy that we were able to link some of the most abundant parasitoid species to some hosts or pests of seed rape. But for, I don't know, 180 out of 200 morphospecies or species in our study, we don't know who are hosts. Yeah.
I want to ask about the subject of the forest islands in the agricultural landscape that you talked about. I wanted to ask, these forest islands, were they also managed or were they left to themselves?
It differs. Unfortunately, I don't have photographs or pictures. So, but in general, it differs. But smaller ones are typically unmanaged, or they are managed in a way that if something happens like a windstorm or whatever, then they are going to get trees which are fallen out of the woodlots and so on. But typically they are not managed and they are not used by anybody with exception of hunters, because in many cases hunters are constructing their posset. Yeah, so they are somehow using them, but in many cases, because they are in the middle of arable lands, they are not visited by anybody. So this is a potential land for improving their management for biodiversity support or conservation. And what is also our interpretation of this study comparing native and invasive woodlots, it seems that also these invasive woodlots are somehow beneficial for biodiversity, or that there was not so strong overlap in species composition between these habitat islands, so they are able to increase at the landscape level biodiversity of many arthropod groups in agricultural landscape. And because they are surrounded by arable land, probability of spreading somehow is very low. So they are not endangering some more important habitats in the surroundings. So, which is in fact the only problem of Rubina pseudoacacia in Czech Republic, that it is able to spread to some xeric grasslands habitats or something like that.
Yeah, I have a question to the yield maps. Are they based on model data or on actual farmer?
There are many different sources of yields mapping data, and in fact, basically there are two main options. One is not very common in Czech Republic. It is much more common in United States or Canada, which is direct measurement during harvest, because you can use something called yield monitoring apparatus on a harvester, and it is in fact it is optically or by weighting some yeah, I will not try to explain details, but in fact you are collecting this data during harvest. But then you should process them somehow in a quite complicated way. Because
connected to that, do you know how stable these are across time? Because I would imagine maybe in the right year, this looks completely different than like.
Of course, in fact, this map, for example, created in collaboration with our colleagues from Brno. It is based on satellite data, and it is average weighted across several years, because of course there is a temporal variability. And yeah.
And does it also take account the farmer switching the crop? For example, if he expects like a more dry year, he might switch to corn.
It will be nice if they will, but what I can show, for example, here in this large block of variable soil, for farmers it can be clever to, and it is also included in our algorithm how to set up non-crop habitat. If he will separate this part of field which has lower yield and to change crop rotation here compared to here, because here of course you can more nutrient demanding species or crops plant with high efficiency, but in this part of field it will be more clever for you to use a different set of crop species. So of course in this way it is we are trying to motivate farmers to think about that.
So if you account for all of that, do you think there will be in the end still some land left that's really not useful for the farmer that would be nice for protection or not?
Yeah, idea is to select based on European Union legislation and new common agriculture policy, we or farmers will be motivated to set aside 5% of arable land strictly for biodiversity support purposes. So our aim is to, in the future, create some cloud application or whatever, which will provide everybody who will be interested in. It can be officer somewhere in the Ministry of Agriculture, or it can be a farmer who is managing this particular land, to check, yeah, these 5% are, from the point of view of ecologists, optimal for setting aside. Probably you will not lose a lot of field, and this tool is our dream to be developed in the future. But in the first step, right now, we are preparing some perspectives, ideas, paper to publish this concept. And then, of course, we are also interested to collaborate with Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Agriculture in real application for Czech Republic.
Thank you very much. I don't see anyone having any more questions. There were no questions online from the people. So thank you very much for coming. It was nice and very applicable. I think people learned a lot. How is it to do something with the farmers and how it works in reality. So it was perfect. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I was